Imagine being cut off by your own parents at 18, and years later discovering that your grandmother had secretly left you an estate worth $3.5 million. Now imagine those same parents walking into the will reading with confident smiles because they believed they would control the money. They thought the inheritance was finally within their reach. But then the judge turned to the next page of the will, and everything changed. What was written there was something nobody in that room expected. When I was 18, my parents told me that I was old enough to take care of myself. They stopped paying for my expenses and made it clear that I was no longer welcome to depend on them. At the time, I thought losing my parents' support was the worst thing that could happen to me. I had no idea that years later, their decision would become the reason they lost control over the one thing they wanted most. The person who never abandoned me was my grandmother. She was not wealthy in the way people imagine wealthy families to be. She lived quietly and rarely talked about money. What mattered to her was that I worked hard and built a life without depending on anyone. Whenever I visited her, and she would ask the same questions. Are you working? Are you saving? Are you building something for yourself? She never told me what was inside her estate, and I never asked. I simply believed she loved me. Then one morning, I received the news that she had passed away. After the funeral, an attorney contacted me and told me that I needed to attend the reading of the will. I expected nothing more than a few personal belongings, maybe some photographs, maybe some jewelry. I was completely unprepared for what came next. The attorney explained that the estate included property, investment, financial accounts, and other assets with a combined estimated value of about $3.5 million. Then he told me that I was the primary beneficiary. I could barely process the words. But there was something even more shocking. My parents had also been invited to the meeting. When they arrived, they looked strangely confident. They were smiling and speaking as though the inheritance already belonged to them. One of them leaned back in the chair and said that managing an estate of that size would be complicated and that they would, of course, help me. I stayed silent. The attorney began reading the will. The first pages described my grandmother's wishes and listed several charitable gifts. Then came the section about her property and investments. My name appeared again and again. My parents stopped smiling. Then the attorney reached a special clause. It stated that the assets were not to be controlled by my parents. Instead, an independent executor would oversee the estate according to the instructions written in the will. My parents had no authority to take possession of the assets simply because they were my parents. According to established probate principles, the person named as executor is responsible for carrying out the instructions of the will, while beneficiaries are the people designated to receive property from an estate. The exact rules can vary by state and individual circumstances. My parents immediately started arguing. They claimed that I was too young to understand what I was receiving. They said they should manage the money. They said my grandmother could not possibly have intended to leave everything to me. Then the judge asked the attorney whether there was another page. The attorney quietly turned the page. There was. My grandmother had anticipated exactly this situation. The next section stated that if anyone attempted to interfere with my inheritance or take control of the estate against her instructions, the independent executor was authorized to protect the assets according to applicable law. The room went completely silent. My parents had walked into that room believing they were going to manage $3.5 million. Instead, they discovered that my grandmother had spent years making sure they could not simply take control of it. The judge explained that the validity and enforcement of a will depend on the law of the relevant jurisdiction, and that probate is the court-supervised process used to determine validity and administer an estate. For the first time, I looked at my parents and saw something I had never seen before: fear. They had spent years believing that cutting me off would make me dependent on them, but my grandmother had quietly taught me the opposite. She had taught me how to stand on my own, and now the inheritance was not just money. It was the final decision she had made about who she trusted. That day, I learned something I will never forget. Money does not always reveal who loves you. Sometimes it reveals who is only waiting for an opportunity. My parents thought they were walking into a room to control my future. My grandmother had already made sure they could not. The biggest surprise was not the $3.5 million. It was discovering that the person who had been treated as powerless had finally become the person nobody could control.